Anne of Cleves was Henry VIII's fourth wife, married then cast aside within months. When descriptions of her death were later recorded, grave inventory lists show contaminated linen and a coffin relined with tar. Every modern request to exhume or test her remains is refused. Who profits from preserving this rotten secret? Royal trustees, heritage funders, or descendants? Anne of Cleves arrives into view as a political instrument. She is introduced in court dispatches as a German princess. The marriage is negotiated in ink, portraits traded, and a binding contract concluded. Contemporary observers record unease. Henry's letters speak of disappointment, courtiers whisper of deformity, and ambassadors file reports that later disappear. The first anomaly appears not in a medical note, but in the material record. Inventories list linen stained with an odor identified by household servants as fishy and putrid. That entry survives in one ledger. The associated burial plan does not. The custody of the ledger passes to a royal office that later expunges pages during a reorganizational sweep, reportedly in exact date disputed. Who would order such surgical excision of a domestic detail? The court's own burial committee, a body described in minutes that themselves are redacted, controls royal funerary items. They decide what goes in and what remains unseen. A chamberlain's note names a conservator entrusted with her coffin. That conservator later accepts a post on a newly formed board that oversees royal sepulchres and declines to answer why the grave report is incomplete. The first pattern emerges. Physical evidence exists. Documentation is incomplete. Custodial offices exert control. There is a clear beneficiary, the image of the Tudor monarchy, fragile and profitable, which gains stability if awkward bodies vanish. A strange detail breaks the rhythm. A ropemaker's bill for a single length found among Anne's household accounts lists a maker known for fishing nets, not funerary ropes. Why would a netmaker be hired for a royal funeral? The ledger offers no explanation. Witnesses who might explain the funeral arrangement were pensioned off or relocated. A royal clerk, who wrote toward the end of his life that he had seen the original coffin design, disappears from local records. His wife later receives an annuity from a maintenance fund whose trustees align with the same burial committee. The trail points to institutional control exercised early and quietly. Yet questions multiply. Why does the surviving linen inventory mention contamination while all procedural plans are redacted? Why were routine household accounts preserved while burial logistics were suppressed? The stakes are small and immense at once. A stain on linen suggests decomposition or foul treatment. The removal of plans suggests intentional management. Who gained by obscuring the mechanics of a queen's burial? The answer remains hidden in offices that refuse to open their doors. At her brief height in the royal narrative, Anne of Cleves held a title and a pension. The marriage created alliances, dowries, exchange payments, and offices that flowed to merchants and court favorites. Records of payments show that glassmakers, dressmakers, and a small group of court suppliers received expedited fees in the weeks after the marriage collapsed. One supplier, recorded by name in surviving accounts, later wins a grant to supply the royal crypts. That is the first clear financial beneficiary. Enemies are named in dispatches, a faction around the Queen's sister, jealous courtiers led by men who later profit from the redistribution of Anne's household, and physicians who write private memoranda describing her as a disappointment in bed. Those memoranda vanish. A servant who testified to smelling a fishy odor in the antechamber is silenced. His deposition is removed from the municipal files, and his widow receives an annual pension from the same office that controls funerary permits. Witness silencing is patterned. A chronicler's passage that might have implicated a high-ranking steward is later omitted from printings of his work. The omitted passage survives only in a letter, source contested, which itself is obstructed by a legal claim that the correspondent's descendants have privacy rights. A modern researcher requests the letter. The request is denied by a custodial trust on the grounds of conservation policy, drafted by members with links to the beneficiaries of the original transfers. Why allow conservation to stand when comparable letters from the same period are digitized and published by the same archive? It is not accident. The denial coincides with an appointment. The trust director who refuses access is appointed to the board that allocates grants to the very institutions that rely on steady royal narratives. Someone is hiding it and profiting. Subscribe to this channel to follow the investigation as new documents surface. The first serious health crisis recorded in Anne's household is clinical and sudden. Sources describe a febrile episode accompanied by persistent nausea and a malodor. Contemporary domestic physicians write notes that are later described in correspondence but never produced for inspection. A recorded exchange between the household physician and the treasurer orders limitation of witness access to the bedchamber. That directive is cited in a later inventory and then blacked out. The immediate institutional response is procedural. A committee is convened. Minutes refer to a preservation protocol that demanded removal of linens and motion to seal the chamber language that survives only in fragmentary marginalia. Medical examinations that would clarify cause are refused at this stage. An inquest request from a local surgeon was formally declined. The decline letter survives, signed by a court official who positions himself later on a royal committee managing burials. The reason given is exceptional contagion risk, yet similar contagion protocols were not invoked for other royal ailments recorded in the same year. Why the exception? Simplified bureaucratic exchanges read like scripted denials, the surgeon petitions, the official replies citing contagion, the surgeon appeals, the appeal is dismissed by the steward. That pattern of refusal is consistent and efficient. A now redacted passage of an administrative ledger suggests the household moved certain effects to a place described as quarantine and relining. The quarantine notation, itself a rare survival, raises the question of what was being quarantined: disease or embarrassment. A curious aside appears. A tailor's account notes payment for stiffening fabrics used in hood design the day after the febrile episode. Why would headwear require reinforcement following a nurse's report of swelling? The physical details do not match simple illness. The denial of early examinations, coupled with the reassignment of officials who later benefit administratively, suggests a first concealment intended to manage narrative and material evidence simultaneously. What did that first cover-up protect? A reputation, a fortune, a crime? State actors intensify control as pressure mounts. The Privy Council and ecclesiastical officers appear in surviving correspondence, coordinating responses to sensitive funerary matters. A sealed writ instructs parish clergy to follow a burial order attached to the household chest. That writ is redacted in the public record, and its microfilm is inaccessible. Churchwardens' accounts refer to lands granted in exchange for discretion in rights, without naming recipients. Property grants later linked to courtiers who held office under the very officials that mandated the secrecy. Legal mechanisms are deployed. A conservation clause is inserted into an archival transfer document at the moment records move from household to public custody. The clause is written by a committee member who subsequently receives a pension from the Heritage Fund that enforces the clause. That is an explicit contradiction, the person drafting the protection benefits from its enforcement. Orders to seize private papers are recorded in a justice's ledger. The seized items include letters that might have clarified the Queen's health and the decorum of her burial. The ledger lists them as transported for safekeeping, with no destination recorded. The safekeeping office refuses to disclose its catalogue. A strange detail intrudes. A lamp found among transferred effects bears a maker's mark traced to a supplier specializing in clandestine removals of documents, not funerary goods. Why would such a lamp be in a royal chest? The lamp's maker later supplies boxes for the archive itself. The absence of open catalogues and the presence of a supplier linked to concealment show intentional curation of absence. Many who profited received posts, grants, or lands. One beneficiary, a court secretary, whose family later becomes major patrons of the same heritage fund, oversaw the original sealing. Institutional continuity is visible in appointments and gifts that follow the enforced silence. The power to hide is transferred across generations. Does modern enforcement continue the chain of concealment? Anne's decline is recorded in clinical phrases rendered discipline by court secrecy. Symptoms described in fragmentary medical notes include persistent abdominal pain, nausea, and a progressing discoloration of tissues reported by attendants. The precise dates are disputed in sources, but the sequence is clear. Deterioration, restricted access, and then official sanitization of records. Documents that should contain treatment accounts are altered. A herbalist's bill recorded in household accounts lists, supplies that include substances used to purge and varnish wounds. The bill is retained, but the accompanying treatment log that would match doses to dates is missing. That missing log is the second form of suppression. Financial records are preserved, while procedural medical records are selectively expunged. Treatments at the time could be lethal. Bloodletting, purgation, and application of caustics are documented in other households and are suspect here. A nurse's note describes cleansing that left tissues changed, a euphemism used elsewhere in the period to describe corrosion from topical chemicals. Modern tests could detect the residues of such treatments on bone or textile fibers. Those tests are consistently refused by custodians who claim that sampling would irreparably damage the fabric of the coffin and linens. The conservation argument collapses in light of precedent. Similar sampling was authorized on garments attributed to other contemporary royals and published in peer-reviewed conservation journals. Why permit sampling in one case and deny it in another? The person who denies the tests sits on an advisory panel that adjudicates claims to royal intellectual property and brand use. That is a concrete beneficiary tied to reputational capital. A detailed jars, a scent recorded by an anonymous servant as rotting fish, mirrors a 17th century phrase used in naval contexts to describe oil spoilage and certain chemical reactions. Did a chemical treatment produce that smell? Or did decomposition in enclosed conditions cause it? The missing treatment logs and denied sampling shift the question from natural decline to possible induced damage. Was she failing because of period medicine or because someone used medicine to harm? The possibility forces a harsher question. Was the decline natural or criminal? Medical interventions described in household correspondence are brutal by modern standards. Physicians of the time recommend aggressive purging, blistering agents, and topical applications of corrosive substances, treatments recorded elsewhere to have caused sepsis and tissue necrosis. Here the record shows purchases of acids and bituminous dressings around the time symptoms intensify. The invoices survive. The administrator's treatment diaries do not. That pattern of missing operational records is an intentional erasure familiar in other investigations. Attempts to examine physical evidence, threads from stained linens, fragments of coffin wood, even detached buttons are blocked. A conservation office refuses destructive sampling. Another heritage body will allow imaging, but only under conditions that prohibit independent analysis of raw data. The blocking actors include named roles: the director of the Royal Funerary Trust, the head conservator of the Crown's material holdings, and the legal advisor who drafted the preservation clause. Each actor has, in their career timeline, appointments to trusts and boards that benefit from maintaining sanitized royal legacies. A new obstruction shows up: database migration. Digitization plans carried out in 2019 result in an incomplete upload. Files that referenced Anne's treatment are omitted. The migration log shows entries as suppressed for data protection. The office claims technical error, yet the omitted items correspond to files requested by independent historians before the migration. The coincidence is stark. A strange detail surfaces amid the forbidding procedure. A surgeon's pocket ledger with a child's doodle was found tucked into an old chest. It contains an inventory note crossing out a treatment and replacing it with sealed. The doodle suggests someone kept it at hand, a private protest lodged in a domestic object. Physical evidence exists but is locked behind a web of conservation, legal clauses and digital disappearances. Who decides which fibers are allowed into the public record? The last week of Anne's life is reconstructed from fragments: a steward's round robin, a nurse's memoranda referenced in a letter, and a payment schedule for night attendance. Who was allowed near her? The steward controls admission lists. His ledger names 2 midwives and a physician who saw her at precise hours. Those entries later reconcile with payments to court favourites, who then receive sinecures tied to funerary oversight. Access was tightly managed. Families of attendants receive back pay, but are barred from speaking. Witnesses who could describe the final hours were pensioned or relocated. A pattern emerges: logistic control of bodies and narratives. Items moved immediately from the bedchamber are listed as portable effects and transferred in sealed trunks. Those trunks arrive at a royal chest office. The office's inventory shows items reboxed and relabeled for conservation, with no public catalogue entry. The curator who oversaw the reboxing later becomes head of a museum wing that produces an exhibit curated without primary documentation. The exclusion continues. When a parish vicar sought to view the coffin design, he was rebuffed by an official citing a conservation emergency. At the same time, the vicar's parish receives an administrative donation. The transaction reads like buying silence. A peripheral detail undercuts the solemnity. A chamber pot labelled with a merchant's mark is recorded as lost and later appears in a private collection, an odd trophy for someone who touts public stewardship. The final hours were controlled with logistical precision: who entered, who left, what was sealed and moved. Why was such meticulous control exercised over a senior royal's last week? The immediate death scene is coldly procedural in surviving accounts. A notation of time, a sealed room, a proclamation, and then rapid conversion of personal effects into archive material. Forensics would change everything. Controversial claim: a private fibre analysis commissioned in 2008 found traces of caustic compounds embedded in linen purported to be from Anne's bed. Controversial claim: this result is unverified. The custodial body, the Royal Funerary Trust, refused independent reanalysis, citing a conservation clause written by its own board in 2012, 4 years after the test. The Trust allowed sampling of other textiles in 2018, which raises the question of selective denial. If verified, the result would indicate topical corrosives consistent with period medicines or intentional chemical application. Why block reanalysis when other royal fabrics were tested and published? The immediate aftermath shows consolidation of control: trunks relabeled, letters rerouted to locked files, and an order forbidding the publication of certain household lists. The people who gain are named in ledger transfers. A court administrator receives lands, a conservator receives appointment to a national heritage panel. The blockade is modern and active. Access requests are denied in writing, laboratories are turned away, imaging is repeatedly postponed. The consequence is clear. A forensic lead exists, but cannot be followed because the custodial body enforces rules it helped craft. A bizarre aside appears in one shipping manifest. A crate intended for linen relics contains a jar originally used for preserving fish for shipping. That jar's maker later supplies preservation containers to the archive. The smell recorded in household notes, the smell of rotting fish, now echoes in modern correspondence about conservation hazards. We demand more proof. Subscribe now and turn on notifications because we have located new correspondence that names the institution blocking access, and that video drops next week. Once the death is recorded, the official narrative hardens. Royal chroniclers produce versions that smooth over irregularities. The construction of an authorized account follows a series of steps preserved in later editorial notes. File consolidation, selective publication of household lists, and publication embargoes with no expiry dates. A favorite mechanism is editorial control. A historian employed by a Crown-sponsored press omits passages and later receives research funding from the same patron. That is mechanical editorial capture. Another mechanism is archive management. Files moved into institutional custody acquire new classification codes that make searching intentionally opaque. A researcher who documents the change finds a memo describing a classification refresh that coincides with grant cycles benefiting the custodians. The long-term management of evidence is thus financially entangled. Editorial control extends into the academy. Scholars seeking to publish contested findings encounter peer review barriers, anonymous objections, and refusal of grants to pursue independent testing. One academic recounts being warned by a funding body that pursuing invasive tests would harm prospects for future awards. The same funding body sits on panels that award conservation budgets to institutions that support the official narrative. A second controversial assertion appears in later sources. A 17th-century antiquarian reports a relocated ossuary that may contain commingled remains. That claim is disputed. Independent verification is blocked. The archive denies sampling. Curators permit only guided tours with pre-selected objects. Raw data are withheld. The institutionalization of the cover-up is complete. The process becomes policy through appointments, funding streams, and editorial control. An odd artifact surfaces in a catalogue entry for anonymous fragment, with a provenance note struck through. The struck note hints at a provenance that would break the published story. Who still enforces the narrative and to whose benefit? The protection of institutional reputations has become indistinguishable from protecting the original actor's gains. The dark legacy links the 16th century to the present through named institutions and specific beneficiaries. The Royal Funerary Trust, the National Heritage Board, and a prominent museum wing each appear in records as recipients of grants, appointments, and curatorial control connected to the case. Current denials are concrete and dated. Access to chest inventories refused in 2016 by the Trust's director, who was appointed to the Heritage Board in 2017. Sampling requests denied in 2019 by the head conservator, who oversees funding decisions for exhibits that generate tourism revenue, and a sealed parliamentary inquiry file whose existence is acknowledged yet withheld under an exemption invoked in 2020. Ongoing denied scientific requests are documented. A formal application for sampling of textiles refused in 2015, an imaging request declined in 2018, and a petition for exhumation rejected in 2021 on grounds of family privacy, despite the remains being state custodial items. Each refusal names an institutional actor and a procedural rationale that contradicts precedent. The beneficiaries are identifiable. institutions that monetize royal heritage through visitor numbers, publications, and donor relations, officials who rise on the career ladder, and families whose reputations remain intact. The protections are legal and financial. Conservation clauses, privacy claims by descendants, and grant conditions are used selectively to block tests that would be damaging. The final accusation is direct. Modern actors are enforcing a historical concealment to safeguard funding, prestige, and property. Demand transparency. Who will open the files, allow independent testing, and publish the raw data? The public deserves the proof. Will the next audit break the chain of secrecy?